This September, the EWG Scarlet Knights Alumni Association invites you to join us to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the founding of Exeter West Greenwich High School. In this video series, we'll chat with longtime faculty and staff to remember some stories you know, and maybe a few you haven't heard.
When was the last time a brand new high school, a public school, not a charter school, but a public school built a brand new high school? So it was unique. It was growing pains because we had been a very tight faculty at Metcalf. We were a 4 through 8 school. We were a small school district. When you only have one team for 7th grade and one team for 8th grade, so you're talking about maybe 100 kids in a class. Because there were people who didn't want the school built in the two communities. They didn't want, I remember we were asked, I think Mr. Pertle was the head of the union at the time, and he had asked teachers, we had like a schedule, and he had asked teachers to go to the school committee meetings. So we would take turns going to the meetings, just, to be informed of what was going on. And I remember there was a gentleman there an older gentleman who had probably born and raised in Exeter. And he didn't understand why they had to build a new school and why they couldn't use some of the buildings over at Ladd School, because Ladd School was being closed down. And that all we had to do was put a new roof on some of those buildings, and those buildings would be fine for a high school. And so he was there. That was one of the meetings that I went to, and he was there talking about, was it necessary to build the school? Then they built the junior, senior high school, and then we went through hiring teachers. I remember that some of the committees I sat on, the hiring committees, we were told, well, you have to think about, do you want to hire a brand new teacher out of college? Or do you want to hire a teacher who has experience? Do you want to hire a teacher who has a lot of experience and is close to retiring? So there were a lot of really big decisions that had to be made. We hired some really great people. We really did. And, Mrs. Bishop is one of them. How lucky were we to get a phenomenal art teacher who had a great reputation in Rhode Island, as an art teacher, or Mrs. Christian, who had a great reputation as a science teacher. So it was really, it was really neat that, but that was also with its growing pains, because we were the teachers who had been there, and sometimes we were referred to as the dinosaurs. And then you had the new teachers coming in with great ideas or new ideas, or there were all sorts of new traditions that had to be made. So it was really, working. And I think we really did work well together and things. But one thing that I do remember, and I think that it's important to remember, is Exeter West Greenwich never had a senior high school. So growing up, we had a huge party in 8th grade. We had a big fancy social, and everybody got dressed up almost like it was a prom. And then you had a graduation big ceremony with a state speaker and everything, because you would go your separate ways. And the West Greenwich kids would go to Coventry, and the Exeter kids would either go to South Kingstown or North Kingstown, depending on where you lived in Exeter. In North Kingstown, we were known as the potato pickers. We were the Exeter potato pickers. 2 years, we did not go to 9th grade at the high school. I was one of the years we didn't go at the high school. We didn't go to any of the high schools for 9th grade because the taxpayers cut the budget. The town couldn't afford to send us to 9th grade. So we stayed at Metcalf for 9th grade. So they had to hire teachers, and we had these leftover books, and we stayed for 9th grade. So then when we went to the high school, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, we were even at more of a disadvantage, because you didn't enter as a freshman, you entered as a 10th grader. Yeah. I remember taking a trigonometry class, and if it snowed, the kids from Exeter would be dismissed early, because the buses had to travel farther than the North Kingstown buses, and we'd be dismissed early. And I remember being in class, and an announcement came over that said Exeter students were to be dismissed, and I got up to leave, and the teacher said to me, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Well, we were just dismissed." And he goes, "Wait a minute, you're a girl and you're from Exeter and you're in this class?" So there were teachers, not a lot, but there were still teachers at North Kingstown High School who really kind of looked down on the Exeter kids. It was really a great thing to have the junior senior high school built in Exeter, West Greenwich, because it really gave the towns a real sense of identity and tradition. And the neat thing is the previous classes in the 90s, you started making those traditions, and you had like the fortune of starting something new, and some of those things maybe are still going on today at EWG. So it's really kind of cool to have, the kids in the 90s start those things. Yeah. See, we really weren't allowed over there. Like the teachers at Metcalf weren't really allowed to go over. I do remember the scramble to get in the building. And I remember school committee members there to help us move. Like everything was boxed up, and the maintenance people would ship things over and put the boxes in your classroom. But I remember like the school was supposed to start, and we were all over there. And like I said, school committee people were there. And then we went on strike. So because they didn't really have an occupancy certificate for us to even start school. So some of the senior high classrooms were not ready for them to move into. Yeah, because the building wasn't done. I had always been teaching 7th grade at Metcalf. And Mr. Cooney went to the high school. And so I got promoted to 8th grade. I was really excited about that. I thought that was really neat, because now I could teach algebra. When they cut the budget for sports, and EWG Kids was founded to raise money so that we could have sports. We had sports teams when the school opened, and then I can't remember whether it was the second year or third year or what year it was that they cut the budget. And they formed EWG Kids, and they did a ton of fundraising. It could be that we didn't have a lot of home games, because then we'd have to pay the officials and pay coaches' salaries. And there were some teachers who were coaches who said, you know what, thanks, but no thanks, I'll coach them this year, and you don't, use that money for, to get uniforms or whatever. There were a lot of parents who stepped forward and did a lot of things. It's a neat school. It really is a neat school with lots of traditions, like the Midnight Madness. I enjoyed, there were things like I loved when we had the volleyball games and the basketball games. That was really fun. We had a hypnotist who was there. That was fun. Breakfast in the morning, and seeing, I think, the superintendent there helping to make breakfast. That was always fun. I loved the night in the hallway. Mr. Clayman found that night in like an antique shop. I know when my kids were little and we used to walk past it and go, shh. I'd say to them, shh, don't wake up the knight, because he's the giant knight, because he's really big. So they'd tiptoe past the knight. I remember Mr. Clayman picked the school colors, and he picked the school mascot. I do remember that there was a copyright or something, and so I think he really, and I could be wrong because that was a long time ago, I think he really was an advocate to get it, and he had to go to Rutgers and get a letter stating that we could use it. Mrs. Conroy came over, Miss Carr came over. Oh, Mr. Anderson was there, that's right, he was downstairs. Mrs. Brown came over. Mr. Cooney went to the high school. Mr. Pirtle, he was downstairs next to the art room. And then he eventually went over to the high school. I was upstairs in the end room. Mrs. Luther came over. Mrs. Luther was across the hall from me, and she taught English. And then eventually Miss Furr was across the hall from me. She taught foreign language. Mrs. Ross was across the hall. She was a special education teacher. Mr. Watsky came over from Metcalf because he was hired the last year we were at Metcalf. Oh, Mr. Bromell came over. How could I forget Mr. Bromell coming over? He did PE. He's still there because we were hired the same year. Mrs. Edwards went to the high school. She came over. Mrs. Ohm came over. So Mrs. Luther was Mrs. Rupp at the time. Mr. Stenhouse came over, yeah, because a ton of teachers were hired, obviously. Mrs. Bosquet came over because she had been the librarian over at Metcalf. Miss Fulford came over. She, Mr. Carpenter, and Mr. Bromell were the gym teachers, were the PE teachers. Mrs. Maynard came over because she was the school counselor. Mr. Cohen was the athletic director. Mr. Smith was the girls' soccer coach. Maybe he was an assistant because his picture's here.
Oh, wow.
Yep, assistant coach, Joe Smith. Mr. Bromell, he's still coaching the boys' basketball team. Oh, and the sword, that's a really cool tradition. And they would be outside. I love that graduation outside. That was really cool. Little Nell. So Mrs. Edwards was still directing plays. It was either a play or skits, and somebody threw a pie, and the pie hit the curtains.
I remember that.
Oh, and Mr. Clayman went berserk because it was the curtains. It's still a stain. Yeah. Mrs. Sharkey had the best classes, and we could order lunch, and we'd go down, and the kids would cook lunch for us, and you could get like a sandwich or soup or apple pie, and the kids would make everything. It was really neat. And I remember Mary Christian, she would do at Halloween, she would do an afternoon, and so faculty members could bring their kids in, and she would dress up like a witch, and she would do, she did this science experiment with pennies. I'll never forget because I took my niece to it. I remember another thing, speaking of Mary Christian, that she did when she taught science. She did like this forensic unit, and she would, it was a whodunit. And and it was always a faculty member. A faculty member had done something. And the kids had to go through, and she would give them clues, and they had to do all this science stuff. Because I remember the first year she did it was Mrs. Pirtle was the one who had, and I don't know whether she had a hair strand or what she had, but it was all part of her class. You talk about like hands-on stuff that kept the kids engaged. She was really, really good at that. So like having the junior, senior high school really helped the community grow in a lot of ways. There really were a lot of benefits. And having kids stay together and not go off everywhere. An April vacation, we went to Paris with Mrs. Bishop, Mrs. Lind. It was 93. Yeah, Miss Lind went because she and I were roommates. We were roommates together. And we stayed in a hotel. The rooms were tiny. And we weren't far from Jim Morrison's grave. So a bunch of the kids went out at night to see Jim Morrison's grave at night. Yes, Mrs. Bishop organized it. She took us to Giverny, to Monet's garden. So she arranged this side trip. And like the tour group that we used were like, well, we don't do that. And she was like, no, we do that. So she herself arranged for the bus to take us to Giverny. And we stayed there for hours and walked around, and the kids could sketch, and it was a great trip. I remember that trip. And then I remember a ski trip. Diane Narcissi and Elaine, Mrs. Capabianco. It was Martin Luther King weekend, and it was freezing, like below zero temperatures, like frostbite. Yeah, it was cold. I think Diane had a ski club. I think I helped with the cheerleaders at Metcalf, the 8th grade cheerleaders at Metcalf. And then we went over to the junior, senior high school, and I became the advisor to the senior high cheerleaders. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget a big change that I never realized at first was when you play junior high games, middle school games, they're after school. They're like right after school. Mm-hmm. But the high school games are at night. So you'd be getting on a bus, and getting home or getting back to school like at 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. And we started early. School started so early there, like 7:30, 7:15. It was early. So that was an adjustment. When you talk about going from Metcalf to the junior, senior high school, that was an adjustment. Students driving, you didn't have students driving at Metcalf. Or at least you hoped you didn't have students driving at Metcalf. So to do Mad Hatters now with the junior, senior high school kids, I think that was something that the newer teachers who had come, it was quite a shock. And it's interesting because the music teachers here in South Kingstown, they know Joe Smith. I mean, they know the legend of Joe Smith. And they know, some of them know about Mad Hatters. You talk about a teacher who makes an impact on kids' lives, and he really did that. really did that. Oh, Mrs. Edwards and I, one year, oh, I'll never forget this. One year we dressed up as the witches from Macbeth. And so we had a cauldron and we had dry ice in it. And I had gone to a bait shop and gotten live eels. She's awesome and a great drama teacher. And she could memorize lines. And there I was having to memorize these lines that the witches do, you know, so we would have this little dialogue. And of course I'd forget half the lines. But so we did a little scene and we had a light on us and we had like the dry ice doing so the dry ice would make like the cauldron look like it had boiling water. And I would reach in and I had gloves on because I wouldn't touch the eels with my bare hands. And I would reach in and get an eel and pull an eel out and the eel is like, you know, squiggling around. Oh gosh. Yeah. And then Mad Hatters is a nice memory that I hope students remember that, you know, they'll say, yeah, I remember when we used to do Mad Hatters, because their kids will never do something like that. Their own children won't, you know, have that experience in the woods, walking through the woods. Because I think when Mr. Wallace and Miss Bricado came, they made these proclamations, and I think it was like the Knights of the Round Table thing, and then on it you would get what you took part in when you were in the junior high school for 2 years. Like if you were in band or if you were in chorus or, you know, they tried to do one for every student. And so we would do that. We would give those out, give little awards out. Mr. Watsky would do the Giving Tree. He would read like the Giving Tree and we'd show the pages up on a projector and then we'd give out awards to kids who went above and beyond to help other people. So we do the candle lighting for the National Junior Honor Society and then we do the promotion. It wasn't without its controversy, as all buildings are, you know, when a town is going to build a building. And it's really nice. I kind of get a little sense of pride, even though I've been in South Kingstown now since 2003. It's really neat when you see a car that has an EWG sticker on it. So, you know, I have great memories of Exeter, West Greenwich.